My daughter was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and she says it's all my fault. Those were the words echoing in my head as I sat in the cold, airless courtroom, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my nails dug into my skin. The overhead lights were merciless, casting a pale glare over the polished wooden benches and the faces that wouldn't meet mine. Somewhere to my left, the court clerk shuffled papers. To my right, a guard shifted his weight, his eyes trained on the young woman in the defendant's chair. Madison, my daughter. She didn't look at me when the verdict was read. She didn't even flinch when the gavel struck. She just stared ahead, jaw set, shoulders squared, as if she'd been expecting this all along. But when the bailiff moved to escort her out, she glanced over her shoulder, not to seek comfort, not to search for any sign of love, but to make sure I saw the accusation in her eyes. I did. It hit me harder than any sentence the judge could deliver. The judge's voice was a low, steady drone, but the words carried a finality that squeezed the air from my lungs. 10 years state penitentiary without the possibility of parole for the first 5. Gasps rustled through the gallery. A woman in the back began to cry softly. My throat burned, but no sound came out. Madison was already being led away, her wrists cuffed, her head high. And me? I was rooted to the bench, a spectator to my own failure. When the door swung shut behind her, a silence heavier than the verdict itself settled over the room. I kept waiting to wake up, to realize this was a nightmare, but the chill in my fingers told me otherwise. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I was a good mother, or at least I thought I was. I worked hard, kept a roof over our heads, tried to teach her right from wrong. I told myself that if I loved her enough, she'd be okay. But somewhere along the way, I lost her. Maybe it was the day her father walked out. Maybe it was long before that. Or maybe I never really had her to begin with. The bailiff's footsteps faded down the hall, and with them, any illusion I had left. The last image of her burned into my mind wasn't of the little girl who used to curl up on my lap with a book. It was of the young woman glaring at me through the thick glass of the defendant's booth, telling the court in her own silent way that this was all on me. I pressed my palms together, forcing my breath into some semblance of control, but my mind was already spinning backward, clawing at the threads that had unraveled to bring us here. Seabrook, Oregon. The sound of waves against the rocky shore, the cry of gulls overhead, the way the air smelled of salt and cedar. My mother's house with its peeling white paint and the porch swing that never stopped creaking. That's where it started. Or maybe that's where it started to fall apart. We'd always been a small family, just me and my mother, Patricia. She raised me on her own in that little coastal town, teaching me how to fix a leaky faucet, how to drive stick, how to stand my ground when people underestimated me. She was as steady as the tides, and I thought I'd inherited her resilience. I thought I could weather anything, even heartbreak. But nothing could have prepared me for what came after I left Seabrook for college. I thought I was running toward a brighter future. Instead, I was walking straight into the storm that would change everything. As I sat in that courtroom, the smell of old wood and stale coffee filling my lungs, I realized I'd been here before, not in this exact place, but in this exact feeling. The moment when you know something is breaking and you can't stop it. Back then, it was just the creak of the porch swing, the low hum of my mother's voice in the kitchen, and the whisper of waves beyond the dunes. It was the safety I thought would always be waiting for me. But I left it behind. I left her behind. And the next time I returned to Seabrook, I wasn't the same girl who'd left. I was someone who'd already lost more than she could carry. I should have seen it coming. The choices I made, the people I trusted, they all led here. To this moment, to Madison's sentence, to the gavel's echo still pounding in my ears. How did we end up here? I wish I had an answer. But to understand that, you'd have to go back with me to a winter in Portland, the glint of ice under a canopy of string lights, and the first time I met Chase Whitman. And to the moment I thought my life was beginning, when in truth it was already unraveling. Portland, Oregon. Winter of 2004. The city was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, the kind that softened streetlights into halos and made every sound feel closer. I remember the way my boots crunched over frost as I walked toward the outdoor rink at Pioneer Courthouse Square, my scarf pulled high over my cheeks, my breath curling in the cold. I'd only been in Portland for a year, juggling classes at the university and a part-time job at a bookstore that smelled of paper and cinnamon coffee. That night was supposed to be a break, a chance to forget exams and bills, to glide under the glow of string lights like I was part of some winter postcard. The rink was alive with the scrape of blades, bursts of laughter, and the faint hum of holiday music from hidden speakers. I tightened my laces, stepped onto the ice, and let the chill sting my nose. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the rail, one hand shoved into the pocket of his dark coat, the other holding a paper cup that steamed in the cold air. His hair was the kind of dark that caught gold under the lights, and his smile, aimed at a little boy tumbling onto the ice, was easy and unguarded. He didn't look like the kind of man who'd change my life, but then, people rarely do in the beginning. I skated past, pretending not to notice when his eyes followed me. It wasn't until my second lap that he stepped onto the ice, his movements confident, as if he'd been born on skates. He matched my pace easily. "You're fast," he said, his voice warm despite the chill. "I'm trying not to freeze," I shot back, not breaking stride. He laughed, a sound that lingered in the air. "I'm Chase Whitman." I hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Ava," I said. We circled the rink together, talking about nothing and everything. Favorite books, worst professors, the way the city seemed quieter at night. He told me he was studying business, working part-time at his uncle's firm. I told him about the bookstore, how I was saving up for my own place. Somewhere between a clumsy turn and a near fall, his hand caught mine. It was warm, steady. He didn't let go, and I didn't pull away. When the rink closed, we walked to a cafe on the corner. The windows fogged with heat, the smell of espresso and baked bread wrapping around us like a blanket. We sat by the window, our jackets draped over the backs of our chairs, and talked until the barista announced last call. I remember thinking that I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. That maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of moment my mother always said was worth waiting for. Outside, the streets were slick with frost, the air sharp enough to make my eyes water. Chase walked me to my car, his breath puffing in the cold. At the door, he paused, his hand resting lightly on the roof. "Same time next week?" he asked. I smiled. Maybe. It felt like the start of something, and it was just not the kind I imagined. Over the next few months, he became a fixture in my life. He'd meet me after class, bring me coffee before work, call me late at night just to hear my voice. We spent weekends exploring the city, tiny art galleries, food carts hidden down side streets, rooftop views of the river. He made me feel like I was the center of a story I didn't know the ending to. Looking back, maybe that was the first warning sign. How easily I let him into my world, how quickly I began to orbit his. There was a night in late February when we stood on the Burnside Bridge, the Willamette River dark and restless beneath us. Snowflakes clung to my hair, melted against my skin. Chase looked at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You ever feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be?" he asked. I nodded because in that moment I did. But I didn't know that sometimes that feeling isn't destiny, it's a trap. If I had, maybe I would have turned away then. Maybe I wouldn't have let myself fall so quickly, so deeply. I didn't know it yet, but the night I met Chase Whitman was the first step on the path that would lead me back to Seabrook and to the cold bench of a courtroom, watching my daughter being led away in handcuffs. And by then it would already be too late to change the ending. The first year with Chase felt like a movie I didn't want to end. He had a way of making the everyday feel extraordinary, turning grocery shopping into an adventure, rainy afternoons into lazy, tangled hours under a blanket, late-night drives into something almost sacred. By spring, we were inseparable. His small apartment in the Pearl District became ours, though only my name was still on the lease for my studio across town. I kept it for a while, telling myself it was practical, but the truth was I barely went there anymore. He liked things his way. His coffee dark, his shirts pressed, his mornings quiet. I didn't mind bending at first. It felt like compromise, not sacrifice. I told myself this was what building a life together looked like. We talked about the future in the abstract. Traveling to Europe someday, getting a bigger place when the timing's right, maybe starting a family in a few years. Those were dreams we kept in the background, vague enough to stay pretty. But reality has a way of rushing the script. It was a Tuesday in late October when I realized my period was 2 weeks late. I remember standing in the tiny bathroom, the hum of the vent fan loud in my ears, the pregnancy test shaking in my hands. 2 pink lines stared back at me like a secret I hadn't decided whether to tell. For a full day, I carried it around like something fragile, rehearsing how I might tell him. I imagined a quiet dinner, his eyes lighting up, maybe even tears. I let myself believe he'd be surprised but happy. When I finally told him, it was nothing like that. He'd just come home from work, tie loosened, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I set his coffee down on the table and said softly, "Chase, I'm pregnant." He froze, coffee halfway to his lips. "You're what?" "I'm pregnant," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long, heavy silence. Then he set the cup down and leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. We talked about waiting, Ava. This isn't the plan. I tried to smile through the knot in my throat. I know it's sooner than we thought, but no, his voice was sharper now, cutting through mine. This changes everything. I'm not ready for this. We're not ready. The words felt like ice water poured over my chest. Over the next few days, he grew distant, working late, avoiding eye contact. When we did talk, it was about logistics, not feelings, how small the apartment was, how expensive everything would be, how it would derail his career plans. One night, I came home to find a half-packed suitcase by the door. My heart stuttered. "What's this?" He didn't look up from the shirt he was folding. "You should go back to Seabrook for a while. Stay with your mom. Figure things out. Figure things out." My voice cracked. "You mean figure out how to do this without you?" He sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Ava, I can't do this right now. I'm sorry. Sorry." As if the word could erase the sharp edge of rejection, as if it could soften the sound of my heart breaking. By morning, it was decided, not by me, but by him. I packed my clothes in silence, every movement heavy, my mind trying to make sense of how we'd gone from warm nights on the couch to this cold distance. The rain was steady that day, soaking through my coat as I dragged my suitcase down the street. I didn't look back at the building, afraid that if I did, I might see him watching from the window, or worse, not watching at all. The bus ride to Seabrook was long and quiet, the gray landscape sliding past the window like a film I wasn't part of anymore. My hometown greeted me with the familiar scent of salt and cedar, the gulls calling above the harbor, the sea stretching endlessly beyond the docks. When my mother opened the door, I could barely speak. She took one look at me, at my pale face, my trembling hands, and pulled me into her arms. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're home now." I didn't know then that home would be both a refuge and a crucible, that the little girl I carried would inherit pieces of a man who'd walked away, and that sometimes those pieces would look back at me from her eyes. If I'd known, maybe I would have been afraid. Maybe I would have braced myself. But in that moment, all I knew was that I'd been left behind and that life, somehow, was still moving forward. Those first months back in Seabrook were a blur of exhaustion and quiet resilience. My mother's house, a weathered 2-story with blue shutters faded by years of salt air, became both my sanctuary and my prison. Patricia Whitman, my mother, had always been a woman of quiet strength. She'd raised me alone after my father drowned in a fishing accident when I was 6, and she'd never once let me see her break. She knew hardship like she knew the tides. Inevitable, sometimes cruel, but always something you learn to work with. When Madison was born on a crisp April morning, my mother was the first to hold her. She cradled the tiny bundle with the same sure hands that had mended fishing nets, painted porch railings, and pulled me close during storms. "She's perfect," she whispered, and for a moment I believed her. Life settled into a rhythm. I took the day shifts at a small diner on Main Street, serving coffee to fishermen and retirees, while my mother stayed home with Madison. In the evenings, I'd come through the door to find them curled together on the couch, my mother humming an old lullaby, Madison's small fingers tangled in her sweater. There were nights when I'd stand in the doorway, watching them, feeling something bittersweet swell in my chest. Gratitude, yes, but also a faint unease I couldn't name. It was as if Madison, still so tiny, already belonged to my mother in some unspoken way. My own bond with her was different. I loved her fiercely, but the fatigue of balancing work and motherhood left me raw. Some nights, when she cried for hours, I'd pace the creaking hallway until my mother would take her from my arms. "Go rest, Ava," she'd say gently, and I'd collapse into bed, the guilt gnawing at me. As Madison grew, she became the darling of the neighborhood. Everyone knew her, her wide hazel eyes, her quick smile, the way she'd run straight into my mother's arms whenever we came home. At first, I told myself this was good. She was loved. She was safe. But small things began to unsettle me. The way she sometimes looked at me as if I were the visitor, not the parent. How she'd run to my mother for comfort when she fell, bypassing me entirely. And then there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when her expression would shift and I'd see Chase's eyes looking back at me. That same sharp glint when she didn't get her way. That same stubborn set of the jaw. One evening, when Madison was about 4, I came home to find her perched at the kitchen table, eating cookies before dinner. "Madison," I said gently, "you know we eat dessert after." She looked at me, crumbs on her chin, and said flatly, "Grandma said it's okay." My mother, rinsing dishes at the sink, didn't turn around. "She was hungry, Ava. It's just a cookie." "It's not about the cookie," I murmured, more to myself than to her. But that was the thing. My rules were suggestions easily overruled. My authority always secondary. Still, I told myself not to make a battle. Madison was happy. My mother was helping me. And I needed that help more than I wanted to admit. When Madison started kindergarten, I thought maybe things would shift. We'd have our own routines, packing lunches together, walking to school. But even then, she'd come home chattering about how Grandma had picked her up early for ice cream, or how Grandma said she didn't have to do her reading if she was tired. It was love, I told myself. Just love. And yet, on quiet nights, lying in bed listening to the hum of the sea outside, I'd wonder if my daughter would ever see me as the anchor in her life, or if she'd always drift toward the safer, steadier shore of my mother. The first real crack came the summer she turned 11. I'd planned a day at the beach, just the two of us. I imagined building sandcastles, eating fish and chips from the pier, maybe even sharing something real about our lives. But when I told her, she wrinkled her nose. "Can Grandma come?" I smiled tightly. I was thinking just us, Maddie. Some time together. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Okay, but it's more fun with Grandma." It stung more than I wanted to admit. That night, as I watched her sleep, her hair fanned out across the pillow, her small hand curled loosely near her cheek, I felt a chill of recognition. The distance between us wasn't new. It had been growing quietly for years, like a tide pulling back so slowly you didn't notice until the water was gone. I didn't know it then, but the next few years would turn that tide into a riptide, one that would drag us both into deeper waters than I could have imagined. By the time Madison turned 15, the distance between us had hardened into something almost tangible, like a wall we both knew was there but refused to name. She was beautiful in a way that startled me sometimes, with the kind of striking features that turned heads on Main Street. Those hazel eyes, sharp and knowing, framed by a halo of chestnut hair that caught the sun. But there was something else there now. An edge, a restlessness, a hunger for something beyond the sleepy streets of Seabrook. It started small. Missed curfews. Homework that mysteriously disappeared. A new group of friends I didn't recognize. Kids with chipped black nail polish and cigarettes tucked behind their ears, lingering outside the gas station on the corner. One night, I came home from the diner to find Madison slipping through the front door at nearly midnight. "Where have you been?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Out," she said, shrugging out of her jacket. "Out where?" "Just out. Why do you care?" Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and something inside me flared. "Because I'm your mother, Madison. It's my job to care." She rolled her eyes. The gesture, so practiced, cut deeper than any argument. "You're overreacting. Grandma doesn't care." I glanced toward the living room, where my mother sat knitting, her eyes fixed firmly on her yarn. She didn't intervene. She never did. And that silence, more than anything Madison said, made me feel like I was standing on quicksand. Then came Ethan Cole. I first saw him leaning against a battered pickup outside the high school, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was older, 19, maybe 20, with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. Madison climbed into his truck like she'd done it 100 times. That night, I waited up. When she finally came in, the smell of smoke clinging to her hoodie, I asked, "Who's Ethan?" She froze for half a second before tossing her bag onto the couch. "He's just a friend." "He's too old for you." She laughed, a sharp sound that didn't belong to the little girl I once rocked to sleep. "You don't know anything about him." Over the next few months, Ethan became a shadow in our lives, never at our door, but always somewhere Madison was. Her grades slipped. Money went missing from my wallet. I found a half-empty bottle of vodka under her bed. I tried everything, grounding her, taking away her phone, even begging her to talk to me. Each attempt only pushed her further away. "You're just trying to control me," she spat one night, slamming her bedroom door so hard the frame rattled. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in March. I came home early from work, the diner slow because of the storm. The house was quiet, too quiet. Madison's room was empty, her bed unmade, a window left open to the damp salt air. I called her cell. No answer. I called my mother. "She's not here, Ava," Patricia said, her voice tight. Hours later, just after midnight, headlights swept across the driveway. Madison climbed out of Ethan's truck, her hair plastered to her face from the rain. "Get inside," I said, standing in the doorway. She brushed past me, the scent of whiskey hitting me like a slap. "I'm fine," she muttered. "You are not fine," I said, my voice shaking now. "You're 15, Madison. This stops now." She turned, her eyes cold. "You can't make me. You're never here. Grandma's the one who takes care of me. You're just—" She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Just what? Just the woman who gave birth to her? Just the one who paid the bills? The next morning, she was gone. No note, no call. Just an empty room and a closet missing half its clothes. I searched everywhere. Friends' houses, the pier, the rundown apartments near the edge of town. Nothing. Patricia tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry etched into her face. "She'll come back, Ava. She's testing her limits." But days passed, then weeks. Every time the phone rang, my stomach twisted. Every knock on the door sent my heart racing. When she finally did come back, it wasn't because she wanted to. It was because trouble had found her. It was during a business trip to Newport that the first flicker of light broke through the fog that had settled over my life. I hadn't planned to go. My manager at the diner had all but shoved me toward the conference, insisting I deserved the chance to train with the regional staff. I went because saying no felt like standing still, and standing still was something I could no longer afford to do. The hotel sat across from the marina, its windows catching the reflection of sailboats rocking gently in the harbor. I checked in, dumped my bag on the bed, and stood there for a moment, listening to the low hum of rain against the glass. Seabrook wasn't far, less than an hour's drive, but it felt like another world entirely. I met Thomas Walker on the second day. He was standing at the coffee station in the conference hall, wearing a navy sweater and the kind of easy smile that made strangers feel like old friends. His hair was silver at the temples, his eyes the clear blue of winter skies. "You look like you could use something stronger than conference coffee," he said, handing me a paper cup. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from myself in months. I'm not sure that exists. We ended up sitting together during the next session, then over lunch. He told me he ran a small bookstore back in Newport, inherited from his father. I told him about the diner, about Seabrook, about Madison, though I kept the roughest parts tucked away, at least at first. By the third day, I found myself looking for him in the crowd. There was something about Thomas, steady, grounded, that made me feel less like I was balancing on the edge of something I couldn't see. After the conference, he walked me to my car. "If you're ever in Newport again," he said, "stop by the shop. I'll make sure the coffee's better." I did stop by. The following week, I drove up on my day off. The shop was a narrow, sunlit space that smelled of paper and cedar. Thomas was behind the counter, rearranging a stack of hardcovers. "Ava Whitman," he said, smiling like he'd been waiting for me all day. We began meeting once a week. Sometimes we walked along the marina, sometimes we sat in the shop after closing, talking over cups of tea. I told him more about Madison, the girl she used to be, the fights, the nights I lay awake wondering if she was alive. He listened without judgment, without offering solutions I hadn't asked for. One rainy afternoon in late October, Thomas said, "Would you let me try something?" "What do you mean?" "I'd like to meet her, Madison. No pressure, no lectures, just maybe she'd talk to me." I hesitated. "She barely talks to me." "Maybe that's the point," he said gently. "Sometimes it's easier with someone who isn't tangled in the mess." It took 2 weeks to convince her. She didn't agree out of interest, just boredom, I think. I told her we'd meet at a small cafe halfway between Seabrook and Newport. The day of the meeting, I got there early. My hands wouldn't stop fidgeting around my mug, steam curling into the cool air. Madison arrived 10 minutes late, her hood pulled up, her expression unreadable. "This is Thomas," I said, my voice careful. He smiled at her like she was the only person in the room. "I've heard a lot about you." She didn't answer right away, just stared at him, then at me. But she sat down. For an hour they talked, or rather, Thomas asked questions, and Madison gave answers that grew longer as the minutes passed. I didn't say much. I just watched, something warm and fragile settling in my chest. When it was over, Madison stood. "I'll see you around," she said to Thomas. To me, she added, "Don't make a big deal out of this." But it was a big deal. It was the first time in months I'd seen her sit still, speak without the sharpness that had become second nature. Driving home, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe we could find our way back to each other. That maybe, with Thomas's help, we could bridge the distance. I didn't know it then, but that afternoon in the cafe would be the last time I'd see her before everything collapsed. The call came just after midnight. I was half asleep on the couch, the TV humming low in the background, when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to ignore it. Calls at that hour rarely bring good news. But something in my gut told me to answer. "Ms. Whitman." The voice on the other end was clipped official. "This is Officer Ramirez with the Newport Police Department. We have your daughter in custody." For a second, I couldn't make the words make sense. "There must be a mistake," I said. "I'm afraid not. She was arrested tonight on possession with intent to distribute." The air seemed to vanish from the room. "Where is she? Is she hurt?" She's fine. She's at the station. You can come down now. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, rain was coming down in sheets. The fluorescent lights above the entrance flickered against the wet pavement, the hum of the sign loud in the stillness. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee hit me like a wall. They led me to a small interview room. Madison was already there, sitting on the far side of a metal table, her wrists free but her posture defensive. She looked older somehow, her eyes darker than I remembered from the cafe just weeks ago. What happened? My voice was barely above a whisper. She leaned back in the chair, her expression flat. You don't need to play dumb, Mom. I'm not playing, Madison. What are you talking about? You did this, she said, her tone icy. You made me into this. The words hit harder than any slap. I've done everything I could to keep you safe, I said. I know. You did everything to control me, to keep me under your thumb. And now look at me. Her laugh was sharp, bitter. 10 years. That's what they're saying. 10 years. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. The amount she was carrying, Officer Ramirez said from the doorway, his voice neutral. It's a serious charge. I turned back to Madison. Why, baby? Why would you? Don't call me that, she snapped. I'm not your baby. I'm your mistake. It was as if the floor had dropped away beneath me. I reached for her, but she pulled back, folding her arms like armor. They let me see her again a week later, after she'd been moved to the county jail. I brought clothes, books, anything I thought might make the sterile walls a little less crushing. She accepted them without looking at me. Thomas asked about you, I said, desperate to find some thread to hold onto. Her jaw tightened. I don't care. He cares about you. He believes you can still stop. Her voice was cold enough to freeze the air between us. I don't want his pity, and I don't want yours. We sat in silence, the hum of the fluorescent light above us filling the space where our words should have been. I wanted to tell her I loved her, that I would be there no matter what. But the words felt useless, flimsy against the weight of everything between us. When the guard came to take her back, she stood without looking at me. As she reached the door, she said, almost to herself, This is on you, Mom. All of it. I watched her walk away, each step pulling her further into a world I couldn't follow. That night, I drove back to Seabrook in the dark, the ocean hidden beyond the cliffs, its roar muted by the storm. Thomas was waiting on my porch, a blanket over his shoulders, a mug of tea in his hands. I'm sorry, he said as I stepped into the light. I sank into the chair beside him, the damp seeping into my bones. She hates me, I whispered. She's hurting, he said gently. It's easier to aim that hurt at the person who loves you most. I don't know if I can fix this. He looked out at the rain. Maybe it's not about fixing it. Maybe it's about standing here until she's ready to turn around. I didn't answer. The storm raged on, the wind rattling the windows, but Thomas stayed beside me, silent, steady. I didn't know it then, but we didn't have much time left together. And Madison, she was about to disappear from my life in a way I couldn't imagine. The first sign something was wrong with Thomas came quietly. He canceled dinner one night, saying he'd caught a cold. By the following week, the cold had turned into fatigue, and soon after, fatigue became weight loss he couldn't hide. I offered to take him to the doctor, but he brushed me off with that easy smile of his, the one that always made me feel like the world was just a little more manageable. It wasn't until I found him doubled over in his kitchen, gripping the counter to stay upright, that he finally agreed. The diagnosis came fast, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The words felt impossible to process, like the doctor had spoken them in another language. I remember staring at the chart, at the neat black print on white paper, and thinking how absurd it was that something so devastating could look so ordinary. Thomas tried to keep things light in the weeks that followed. We still sat on my porch, still talked about the sea and the gulls and the way the light hit the water at dusk. But there was a new fragility to him, like a thread stretched too tight. When the end came, it was on a quiet morning in late spring. I was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, when his breathing slowed, then stilled. The silence that followed was immense, like the world had paused just to acknowledge his absence. In the days after, I moved through the motions, calling relatives, arranging a small service, answering messages from people whose names I barely remembered. But one thing kept circling in my mind: a small, sealed envelope Thomas had left with my name on it. It took me a week to find the courage to open it. Inside was a short letter written in his neat, steady hand. Ava, if you're reading this, it means I've gone where I can't keep my promise to you in person. So I'll make it here instead. Don't let Madison's anger be the last thing between you. She's lost, but she's still your daughter. And I believe, more than anything, that she can find her way back if she knows you're waiting. I've left what I can to make her path easier. Use it if she's ready. I trust you'll know when that day comes. Thomas, my hand shook as I read it again, the ink blurring through my tears. 2 weeks later, I got word that Madison had been granted a brief furlough to attend Thomas's memorial. I didn't expect her to come to the house afterward, but late that evening, I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. She stepped into the kitchen, her hair damp from the fog, her eyes wary. In her hand was the envelope with her name on it, the one Thomas had left for her. I just wanted to get this, she said, her voice low. I nodded, not moving closer. It's yours. For a long moment, she didn't leave. She just stood there, turning the envelope over in her hands. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, in a way she hadn't in years. Neither of us spoke. I didn't ask her to stay, and she didn't offer. But there was something in her gaze, a flicker, a crack in the wall she'd built. Finally, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and walked toward the door. Just before she stepped out, she paused. Mom. Yes. My voice caught. Thanks for not giving up. And then she was gone, swallowed by the fog. The next time I saw her was months later, on the shore at low tide. She was sitting on the rocks, staring out at the horizon. I walked over, sat beside her. The gulls wheeled overhead, the ocean stretched endless and gray. She didn't speak, but after a moment, her hand found mine. We sat like that, the salt air in our lungs, the steady pulse of the waves between us. It wasn't a reunion, not yet, but it was something, a thread, fragile but real, stretching between us. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe it might hold.